Today I'm at the beach again, and I'm hoping you can hear me. I am right by the water. Today I'm going to be reading you The Voyage of the Dawn Trader by C.S. Lewis. It's the third book in the Chronicles of Narnia, but since it's about ocean adventures, I decided it would be fun to read at the beach. I hope you enjoy and get some rest and relaxation or tingles. Take care of yourself. You really deserve it. Chapter 1. The Picture in the Bedroom. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. His parents called him Eustace Clarence, and masters called him Scrubb. I can't tell you how his friends spoke to him, for he had none. He didn't call his father and mother, but Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. In their house, there was very little furniture and very few clothes on the beds, and the windows were always open. Eustace Clarence liked animals, especially beetles, if they were dead and pinned on a card. He liked books, if they were books of information and had pictures of grain elevators or of fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools. Eustace Clarence disliked his cousins, the four Peevenses: Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. But he was quite glad when he heard that Edmund and Lucy were coming to stay, for deep down inside him, he liked bossing and bullying. And though he was a puny little person who couldn't have stood up even to Lucy, let alone Edmund, in a fight, he knew that there are dozens of ways to give people a bad time if you are in your own home, and they are only visitors. Edmund and Lucy did not at all want to come and stay with Uncle Harold and Aunt Alberta, but it really couldn't be helped. Father had got a job lecturing in America for 16 weeks that summer, and Mother was to go with him because she hadn't had a real holiday for 10 years. Peter was working very hard for an exam, and he was to spend the holidays being coached by old Professor Kirk, in whose house the four children had had wonderful adventures long ago in the war years. If he had still been in that house, he would have had them all to stay. But he had somehow become poor since the old days, and was living in a small cottage with only one bedroom to spare. It would have cost too much money to take the other three all to America, and Susan had gone. Grown-ups thought her the pretty one of the family, and she was no good at schoolwork, though otherwise very old for her age. And Mother said she would get far more out of the trip to America than the youngsters. Edmund and Lucy tried not to grudge Susan her luck, but it was dreadful having to spend the summer holidays at their aunt's. "But its fault was for me," said Edmund, "because you at least have a room of your own, and I shall have to share a bedroom with that rugged stinker, Eustace." The story begins on an afternoon when Edmund and Lucy were stealing a few precious minutes alone together. And of course they were talking about Narnia, which was the name of their own private and secret country. Most of us, I suppose, have a secret country. But for most of us, it is only an imaginary country. Lucy were luckier than other people in that respect. Their secret country was real. They had already visited it twice, not in game or in a dream, but in reality. They had got there, of course, by magic, which is the only way of getting to Narnia. And a promise, or very nearly a promise, had been made them in Narnia itself, that they would someday get back. You may imagine that they talked about it a good deal when they got the chance. They were in Lucy's room, sitting on the edge of her bed and looking at a picture on the opposite wall. It was the only picture in the house that they liked. Aunt Alberta didn't like it at all. That was why it was put away in a little back room upstairs. But she couldn't get rid of it, because it had been a wedding present from someone she did not want to offend. It was a picture of a ship sailing nearly straight towards you. Her prow was gilded and shaped like the head of a dragon, with wide open mouth. She had only one mast and one large square sail, which was a rich purple. The sides of the ship, what you could see of them, where the gilded wings of the dragon ended, were green. She had just run up to the top of one glorious blue wave, and near the slope of the wave came down towards you, with streaks and bubbles on it. She was obviously running fast before it came in, listing over a little on her port side. By the way, if you are going to read this story at all, and you don't already know, you had better get it into your head that the left of a ship, when you are looking ahead, is port, and the right is starboard. All the sunlight fell on her from that side, and the water on that side was full of greens and purples. On the other, it was darker blue from the shadow of the ship. The question is, said Edmund, whether it doesn't make things worse, looking at a Narnian ship when you can't get there. Even looking is better than nothing, said Lucy, and she is such a very Narnian ship. Still playing your old game, said Eustace Clarence, who had been listening outside the door and now came grinning into the room. Last year, when he had been staying with the Bevanses, he had managed to hear them all talking of Narnia, and he loved teasing them about it. He thought, of course, that they were making it all up, and as he was far too stupid to make up anything himself, he did not approve of that. "You're certainly not wanted here," said Edmund curtly. "I'm trying to think of a limerick," said Eustace. "Something like this. Some kids who played games about Narnia got gradually balmier and balmier." "Well, Narnia and balmier don't rhyme to begin with," said Lucy. "It's an assonance," said Eustace. "Don't ask him what an assy thingagamy is," said Edmund. "He's only longing to be asked. Say nothing and perhaps he'll go away." Most boys, on meeting a reception like this, would either have cleared out or flared up. Eustace didn't either. He just hung about grinning and presently began talking again. "Do you like that picture?" he asked. "For heaven's sake, don't get him started about art and all that," said Edmund hurriedly. But Lucy, who was very truthful, had already said, "Yes, I do. I like it very much." "It's a rotten picture," said Eustace. "You won't see it if you step outside," said Edmund. "Why do you like it?" said Eustace to Lucy. "Well, for one thing," said Lucy, "I like it because the ship looks as if it was really moving, and the water looks as if it was really wet, and the waves look as if they were really going up and down. Of course, Eustace knew lots of answers to this, but he didn't say anything. The reason was that at that very moment, he looked at the waves and saw that they did look very much indeed as if they were going up and down. He had only been on a ship once, and then only as far as the Isle of Wight, and had been horribly seasick. The look of the waves in the picture made him feel sick again. He turned rather green and tried another look, and then all three children were staring with open mouths. What they were seeing may be hard to believe when you read it in print, but it was almost as hard to believe when you saw it happening. The things in the picture were moving. It didn't look at all like a cinema either. The colors were too real and clean and out of door for that. Down went the prow of the ship into the wave, and up went a great shock of spray, and then up went the wave behind her, and her stern and her deck became visible for the first time, and then disappeared as the next wave came to meet her, and her bows went up again. At the same moment, an exercise book which had been lying beside Edmund on the bed flapped, rose, and sailed through the air to the wall behind it, and Lucy felt all her hair whipping round her face as it does on a windy day. And this was a windy day, but the wind was blowing out of the picture towards them, and suddenly, with the wind came the noises, the swishing of the waves, and the slap of water against the ship's sides, and the creaking, and the overall high, steady roar of air and water. But it was the smell, the wild, briny smell, which really convinced Lucy that she was not dreaming. "Stop it!" came Eustace's voice, squeaky with fright and bad temper. "It's some silly trick you're playing. Stop it! I'll tell Alberta. Ah!" The other two were much more accustomed to adventures, but just exactly as Eustace Clearance said ow, they both said ow too. The reason was that a great cold salt splash had broken right out of the frame, and they were breathless from the smack of it, besides being wet through. "Oh, smash the rotten thing!" cried Eustace, and then several things happened at the same time. Eustace rushed towards the picture. Edmund, who knew something about magic, sprang after it, warning him to look out and not be a fool. Lucy grabbed at him from the other side and was dragged forward, and by this time, either they had grown much smaller or the picture had grown bigger. Eustace jumped to try to pull it off the wall and found himself standing on the frame. In front of him was not glass, but real sea and wind and waves rushing up to the frame as they might be to a rock. He lost his head and clutched at the other two, who had jumped up beside him. There was a second of struggling and shouting, and just as they thought they had got their balance, a great blue roller surged up round them, swept them off their feet, and drew them down into the sea. Eustace's despairing cry suddenly ended as the water got in his mouth. Lucy thanked her stars that she had worked hard at her swimming last summer term. It is true that she would have gone on much better if she had used a slower stroke, and also that the water felt a great deal colder than it had looked while it was only a picture. Still, she kept her head and kicked her shoes off, as everyone who ought to do, who falls into deep water in their clothes. She even kept her mouth shut and her eyes wide open. They were still quite near the ship. She saw its green side towering high above them, and people looking at her from the deck. Then, as one might have expected, Eustace clutched her in a panic, and down they both went. When they came up again, she saw a white figure diving off the ship's side. Edmund was closer beside her now, treading water, and it caught the arms of the howling Eustace. Then someone else, whose face was vaguely familiar, slipped an arm under her from the other side. There was a lot of shouting going on from the ship, heads crowding together above bulwarks, ropes being thrown. Edmund and the stranger were fastening ropes round her. After that followed what seemed a very long delay, during which her face got blue and her teeth began chattering. In reality, the delay was not very long. They were waiting till the moment when she could be got on board the ship without being dashed against its side. Even with all their best endeavors, she had a bruised knee when she finally stood, dripping and shivering, on the deck. After her, Edmund was heaved up, and the miserable Eustace. Last of all came the stranger, a golden-headed boy some years older than herself. Caspian, gasped Lucy, as soon as she had her breath enough. Poor Caspian it was. Caspian, the boy king of Narnia, whom they had helped sit on the throne during their last visit. Immediately, Edmund recognized him too. All three shook hands and clapped one another on the back with great delight. "But who is your friend?" said Caspian almost at once, turning to Eustace with his cheerful smile. But Eustace was crying much harder than a boy. Any boy of his age had a right to cry when nothing worse than a wedding has happened to him, and would only yell out, "Let me go back. I don't like it." "Let you go," said Caspian. "But where?" Eustace rushed to the ship's side, as if he expected to see the picture frame hanging above the sea, and perhaps a glimpse of Lucy's bedroom. What he saw was blue waves, flecked with foam, and paler blue sky, both spreading without a break to the horizon. Perhaps we can hardly blame him if his heart sank. He was promptly sick. "Hey, Rain Elf," said Caspian to one of the sailors. "Bring spiced wine for their majesties. You'll need something warm to warm you. You'll need something to warm you after that dip." He called Edmund and Lucy their majesties because they and Peter and Susan had all been kings and queens of Narnia long before his time. Narnian time flows differently from ours. If you spent 100 years in Narnia, you would still come back to our world at the very same hour of the very same day on which you left. And then, if you went back to Narnia after spending a week here, you might find that 1,000 Narnia years have passed, or only a day, or no time at all. You never know until you get there. Consequently, when the Pevensie children had returned to Narnia last time for their second visit, it was, for the Narnians, as if King Arthur had come back to Britain, as some people say he will. And I say the sooner the better. Ranulph returned with the spiced wine, steaming in a flagon, and 4 silver cups. It was just what one wanted, and as Lucy and Edmund sipped it, they could feel the warmth going right down to their toes. But Eustace made faces and sputtered and spat it out, and was sick again, and began to cry again, and asked, hadn't any plum trees, Vitamized nerve food, and couldn't be made with distilled water. And anyway, he insisted on being put ashore at the next station. This is a merry shipmating for us, brother, whispered Caspian to Edmund with a chuckle. Before he could say anything more, Eustace burst out again. Oh, what on earth's that? Take it away, the horrid thing. He really had some excuse this time for feeling a little surprised. Something very curious indeed had come out of the cabin in the poop and was slowly approaching them. You might call it, and indeed it was, a mouse. But then, it was a mouse on its hind legs and stood about 2 feet high. A thin band of gold passed round his head, under one ear and over the other, and in this was stuck a long crimson feather. As the mouse's fur was very dark, almost black, the effect was bold and striking. Its left paw rested on the hilt of a sword very nearly as long as its tail. Its balance, as it paced gravelly along that swaying deck, was perfect, and its manners courtly. Lucy and Edmund recognized it at once. Reepicheep, the most valiant of all the talking beasts of Narnia, and the chief mouse. It had won undying glory in the second battle of Maruna. Lucy longed, as she had always done, to take Reepicheep up in her arms and cuddle him. But this, as she well knew, was a pleasure she could never have. It would have offended him deeply. Instead, she went down on one knee to talk to him. Reepicheep put forward his left leg, drew back his right, bowed, kissed her hand, straightened himself, twirled his whiskers, and said, in his shrill, piping voice, "My humble duty to your majesty, and to King Edmund too." Here he bowed again. "Nothing except your majesty's presence was lacking to this glorious venture." "Ooh, take it away," wailed Eustace. "I hate mice, and I never could bear performing animals. They're silly and vulgar and sentimental." "Am I to understand," said Reepicheep to Lucy, after a long stare at Eustace, "that this singularly discourteous person is under your majesty's protection? Because, if not..." At this moment, Lucy and Edmund both sneezed. "What a fool I am to keep you all standing here in your wet things," said Caspian. "Come on below and get changed. I'll give you up my cabin, of course, Lucy, but I'm afraid we have no women's clothes on board. You'll have to make do with some of mine. Lead the way, Reepicheep, like a good fellow." "To the convenience of a lady," said Reepicheep. "Even a question of honor must give way, at least for the moment." And here he looked very hard at Eustace. But Caspian hustled them on, and in a few minutes Lucy found herself passing through the door into the stern cabin. She fell in love with it at once. The 3 square windows that looked out on the blue swirling water astern, and the low cushioned benches round 3 sides of the table, the swinging silver lamp overhead, dwarf's work she knew at once by its exquisite delicacy, and the flat gold image of Aslan the lion on the forward wall above the door. All this she took in a flash, for Caspian immediately opened a door on the starboard side and said, "This'll be your room, Lucy. I'll just get some dry things for myself." He was rummaging in one of the lockers while he spoke. "And then I'll leave you to change. If you'll fling your wet things outside the door, I'll get them taken to the galley to be dried." Lucy found herself as much at home as if she had been in Caspian's cabin for weeks, and the motion of the ship did not worry her. For in the old days, when she had been queen in Narnia, she had done a great deal of voyaging. The cabin was very tiny, but bright with painted panels, all birds and beasts and crimson dragons and vines too big for her, but she could manage. His shoes, sandals, and sea boots were hopelessly big, but she did not mind going barefoot on board ship. When she had finished dressing, she looked out of her window at the water rushing past and took in a long, deep breath. She felt quite sure they were in for a lovely time. Chapter 2. On board the John Treader. Oh, there you are, Lucy, said Caspian. We were just waiting for you. This is my captain, the Lord Trinian. A dark-haired man went down on one knee and kissed her hand. The only others present were Reba Cheap and Edmund. Where is Eustace? Asked Lucy. In bed, said Edmund, and I don't think we can do anything for him. It only makes it worse if you try to be nice to him. Meanwhile, said Caspian, we just want to talk. By Jove, we do, said Edmund. And first, about time. It's a year ago by our time since we left you just before your coronation. How long has it been in Narnia? Exactly 3 years, said Caspian. All going well? Asked Edmund. You don't suppose I'd have left my kingdom and put to sea unless all was well, answered the king. It couldn't be better. There's no trouble at all now between Telmarines, dwarves, stalking beasts, fauns, and the rest. And we gave those troublesome giants on the frontier such a good beating last summer that they pay us tribute now. And I had an excellent person to leave as a regent while I'm away. Trumpkin, the dwarf. You remember him? Dear Trumpkin, said Lucy. Of course I do. You couldn't have made a better choice. Loyal as a badger man, and valiant as a mouse, said Trinian. He had been going to say as a lion, but he had noticed Reba James' eyes fixed on him. And where are we heading for? Asked Edmund. Well, said Caspian, that's rather a long story. Perhaps you remember that when I was a child, my usurping uncle Miraz got rid of 7 friends of my father's who might have taken part by sending them off to explore the unknown eastern seas beyond the Lone Islands. Yes, said Lucy, and none of them ever came back. Right. Well, on my coronation day, with Aslan's approval, I swore an oath that if once I established peace in Narnia, I would sail east myself for a year and a day to find my father's friends, or to learn of their deaths and avenge them if I could. These were their names: the Lord Revilian, the Lord Burn, the Lord Argos, the Lord Marframore, the Lord Octesian, and the Lord Restamar, and oh, that other one who's so hard to remember. The Lord Roop, sire, said Trinian. Roop, of course, said Caspian. That is my main intention. But Reba Cheap here has an even higher hope. Everyone's eyes turned to the mouse. As high as my spirit, it said, though perhaps as small as my stature. Why should we not come to the very eastern end of the world
its own country. It is always from the east, across the sea, that the great lion comes to us.
I say, that is an idea, said Edmund in an odd voice.
But do you think,
Said Lucy.
Aslan's country would be that sort of country? I mean, the sort you ever could sail to?
I do not know, madam, said Reepicheep.
But there is this. When I was in my cradle, a wood woman, a dryad, spoke this verse over me.
Where sky and water meet, where the waves grow sweet, doubt not, Reepicheep, to find all that you seek. There is the utter east.
I do not know what it means, but the spell of it has been on me all my life.
After a short silence, Lucy asked,
And where are we now, Caspian?
"The captain can tell you better than I," said Caspian. So Drinian got out his chart and spread it on the table. "That's our position," he said, laying his finger on it. "Or was noon today. We had a fair wind from Cair Paravel and stood a little north from Galma, which we made on the next day. We were in port for a week, and the Duke of Galma made a great tournament for His Majesty, and there he unhorsed many knights, and got a few nasty falls myself, Drinian. Some of the bruises are there still," put in Caspian. "And unhorsed many knights," repeated Drinian with a grin. "We thought the Duke would have been pleased if the King's Majesty would have married his daughter, but nothing came of that. Squints and has freckles," said Caspian. "Oh, poor girl," said Lucy. "And we sailed from Galma," continued Drinian, "and ran into a calm for the best of 2 days, and had to row, and then had to wind again, and did not make Terabithia till the 4th day from Galma. And there their king sent out a warning not to land, for there was a sickness in Terabithia. But we doubled in the cape, and put in at a little creek far from the city, and watered. Then we had to lie off for 3 days before we got a southeast wind, and stood out for 7 isles. The 3rd day out, a pirate, Terabinthian by her rig, overhauled us. But when she saw us well armed, she stood off after some shooting at arrows on either part. And
We ought to have given her chase and boarded her and hanged every mother's son of them,
said Reepicheep. And in 5 days more we were in sight of Mule, which, as you know, is the westernmost of the 7 isles. Then we rowed through the straits and came about sundown into Red Haven on the Isle of Bread, where we were very lovingly feasted and had victual and water at will. We left Red Haven 6 days ago and have made marvelously good speed, so that I hope to see the Lone Islands the day after tomorrow. The sum is, we are now nearly 30 days at sea, and have sailed more than 400 leagues from Narnia.
and after the Lone Islands.
Said Lucy. "No one knows, Your Majesty," answered Drinian, "unless the Lone Islanders themselves can tell us." "They couldn't in our days," said Edmund.
Then,
Said Reepicheep.
it is after the Lone Islands that the adventure really begins.
Caspian now suggested that they might like to be shown over the ship before supper, but Lucy's conscience smote her
I really must go and see Eustace. Seasickness is so horrid, you know. If I had my old cordial with me, I could cure him.
Oh, but you have, said Caspian. I'd quite forgotten about it. As you left it behind, I thought it might be regarded as one of the royal treasures, and so I brought it. If you think it ought to be wasted on a thing like seasickness.
It'll only take a drop,
said Lucy. Caspian opened one of the lockers beneath the bench and brought out the beautiful little diamond flask, which Lucy remembered so well. Take back your own, Queen, he said. They then left the cabin and went out into the sunshine. In the deck there were 2 large, long ashes, fore and aft of the mast, and both open, as they always were in fair weather, to let light and air into the belly of the ship. Caspian led them down a ladder into the after hatch. Here they found themselves in a place where benches for rowing ran from side to side, and the light came in through the oar-holes and danced on the roof. Of course, Caspian's ship was not that horrible thing, a galley rowed by slaves. Oars were used only when wind failed, or for getting in and out of harbor, and everyone, except Reba Cheap, whose legs were too short, had often taken a turn. At each side of the ship, the space under the benches was left clear for the rowers' feet, but all down the center there was a kind of pit, which went down to the very keel, and this was filled with all kinds of things: sacks of flour, casks of water and beer, barrels of pork, jars of honey, skin bottles of wine, apples, nuts, cheeses, biscuits, turnips, sides of bacon. From the roof, that is, from the underside of the deck, hung hams and strings of onions, and also the men of the watch off duty in their hammocks. Caspian led them aft, stepping from bench to bench. At least, it was stepping for him, and something between a step and a jump for Lucy, and a real long jump for Reba Cheap. In this way, they came to a partition with a door in it. Caspian opened the door and led them into a cabin, which filled the stern underneath the cabin. The deck cabins in the poop. It was, of course, not so nice. It was very low, and the sides sloped together as they went down, so there was hardly any floor. Though it had windows of thick glass, they were not made to open because they were underwater. In fact, at this very moment, as the ship pitched, they were alternately golden with sunlight and dim green with the sea. You and I must lodge here, Edmund, said Caspian. We'll leave your kinsmen the bunk and sling hammocks for ourselves.
I beseech your majesty, said Trinian.
No, shipmate, said Caspian. We have argued all that out already. You and Rince was the mate, are sailing the ship, and will have cares and labors many a night when we are singing catches or telling songs. So you and he must have the port cabin above. King Edmund and I can lie very snug here below. But how is the stranger?
Eustace, very green in the face, scowled and asked whether there was any sign of the storm getting less.
But Caspian said, "What storm?" And Trinian burst out laughing. "Storm, young master," he roared. "This is as fair weather as a man could ask for."
Whose thought? Said Eustace irritably. Send him away. His voice goes through my head.
I've brought you something that will make you feel better, Eustace, said Lucy.
Oh, go away and leave me alone,
growled Eustace. But he had a drop from her flask, and though he said it was beastly stuff, the smell in the cabin when she opened it was delicious. It is certain that his face came to the right color a few moments after he had swallowed it, and he must have felt better because, instead of wailing about the store and his head, he began demanding to be put ashore, and said that at the first port he would lodge a disposition against them all with the British consul. But when Reepicheep asked what a disposition was and how he lodged it, Reepicheep thought it was some new way of arranging a single combat. Eustace could only reply, "Fancy not knowing that." In the end, they succeeded in convincing Eustace that they were already sailing as fast as they could toward the nearest land they knew, and that they had no more power of sending him back to Cambridge, which was where Uncle Harold lived, than of sending him to the moon. After that, he sulkily agreed to put on the fresh clothes which had been put out for him and come out on deck. Caspian now showed them over the ship, though indeed they had seen most of it already. They went up on the forecastle and saw the lookout man standing on a little shelf inside the gilded dragon's neck and peering through its open mouth. Inside the forecastle was the galley, or ship's kitchen, and quarters for such people as the boatswain, the carpenter, the cook, and the master archer. If you think it is odd to have a galley in the bows, and imagine the smoke from its chimney streaming back over the ship, that is because you are thinking of steamships, where there is always a headwind. On a sailing ship, the wind is coming from behind, and anything smelly is put as far forward as possible. They were taken up to the fighting top, and at first it was rather alarming to rock to and fro there and see the deck looking small and far away beneath. You realized that if you fell, there was no particular reason why you should fall on board rather than in the sea. Then they were taken to the poop, where Rince was on duty with another man at the great tiller, and behind that, the dragon's tail rose up, covered with gilding, and round inside it ran a little bench. The name of the ship was Dawn Treader. She was only a little bit of a thing compared with one of our ships, or even with the cogs, Drummonds, Carracks, and galleons, which Narnia had owned when Lucy and Edmund had reigned, there under Peter as the High King. For nearly all navigation had died out in the reigns of Caspian's ancestors. When his uncle, Miraz the Usurper, had sent the 7 lords to sea, they had to buy a Gallian ship and man it with hired Gallian sailors. But now Caspian had begun to teach the Narnians to once more be seafaring folk, and the Dawn Treader was the finest ship he had built yet. She was so small that, forward of the mast, there was hardly any deck room between the central hatch and the ship's boat on one side, and the hen coop, Lucy fed the hens, on the other. But she was a beauty of her kind, a lady, as sailors say, her lines perfect, her colors pure, and every spar and rope and pin lovingly made. Eustace, of course, would be pleased with nothing, and kept on boasting about liners and motorboats and airplanes and submarines. As if he knew anything about them, muttered Edmund. But the other two were delighted with the Dawn Treader, and when they turned aft to the cabin and supper, they saw the whole western sky lit up with an immense crimson sunset, and felt the quiver of the ship, and tasted the salt on their lips, and thought of unknown lands on the eastern rim of the world. And Lucy felt that she was almost too happy to speak. What Eustace thought had best be told in his own words, for when they all got their clothes back, dried next morning, he at once got out a little black notebook and a pencil and started to keep a diary. He always had this notebook with him and kept a record of his marks in it, for though he didn't care much about any subject for its own sake, he cared a great deal about marks and would even go to people and say, "I got so much, what did you get?" But as he didn't seem likely to get any marks on the Dawn Treader, he now started a diary. This was the first entry.
August 7th. Have now been 24 hours on this ghastly boat, if it isn't a dream. All the time, a frightful storm has been raging. It's a good thing I'm not seasick. Huge waves keep coming in over the front, and I have seen the boat nearly go under any number of times. All the others pretend to take no notice of this, either from the swank or because Harold says one of the most cowardly things ordinary people do is shut their eyes to the facts. It's madness to come out into the sea in a rotten little thing like this, not much bigger than a lifeboat, and of course absolutely primitive indoors. No proper salon, no radio, no bathrooms, no deck chairs. I was dragged all over it yesterday evening, and it would have made anyone sick to hear Caspian showing off his funny little toy boat as if it was the Queen Mary. I tried to tell him what real ships are like, but he's too dense. E and L, of course, didn't back me up. I suppose a kid like L doesn't realize the dangers, and E is buttering up to sea, as everyone does here. They call him a king. I said I was a Republican, but he had to ask me what that meant. He doesn't seem to know anything at all. Needless to say, I've been put in the worst cabin of the boat, a perfect dungeon, and Lucy has been given a whole room on deck to herself. Almost a nice room, compared with the rest of this place. C says that's because she's a girl. I tried to make him see what Alberta says, that all that sort of thing is really lowering girls, but he was too dense. Still, he might see that I shall be ill if I'm kept in that hole any longer. E says we mustn't grumble, because C is sharing it with us himself, to make room for L. And if that didn't make it more crowded and far worse... Nearly forgot to say that there is also a kind of mouse thing that gives everyone the most frightful cheek. The others can put up with it if they like, but I shall twist his tail pretty soon if he tries it on me. The food is frightful too. The trouble between Eustace and Reepicheep arrived even sooner than might have been expected. Before dinner next day, when the others were sitting around the table waiting, being at sea gives one a magnificent appetite, Eustace came rushing in, wringing his hands and shouting out, "That little brute has half killed me. I insist on it being kept under control. I could bring an action against you, Caspian. I could order you to have it destroyed." At the same moment, Reepicheep appeared. His sword was drawn, and his whiskers looked very fierce, but he was polite as ever. I ask your pardons all, he said, and especially Her Majesty's. If I had known that he would take refuge here, I would have awaited a more reasonable time for his correction.
"What on earth's up?" asked Edmund. What had really happened was this. Reepicheep, who never felt that the ship was getting on fast enough, loved to sit on the bulwarks far forward, just beside the Dragon's Head, gazing out at the eastern horizon and singing softly, in his little chirruping voice, the song that Dryad had made for him. the deck inside the bulwarks made this easier. Everyone on board was familiar with this habit, and the sailors liked it, because when one was on lookout duty, it gave one somebody to talk to. Why exactly Eustace had slipped, reeled, and stumbled all the way forward to the forecastle, he had not yet got his sea legs, I never heard. Perhaps he hoped he would see land, or perhaps he wanted to hang out about the galley and scrounge something. Anyway, as soon as he saw that long tail hanging down, and perhaps it was rather tempting, he thought it would be delightful to catch hold of it, swing Reepicheep round by it once or twice upside down, then run away and laugh. At first, the plan seemed to work beautifully. The mouse was not much heavier than a very large cat. Eustace had him off the rail in a trice, and very silly he looked, thought Eustace, with his little limbs all splayed out and his mouth open. But unfortunately, Reepicheep, who had fought for his life many a time, never lost his head, even for a moment, nor his skill. It is not very easy to draw one's sword when one is swinging round in the air by one's tail, but he did. And the next thing Eustace knew was 2 agonizing jabs in his hand, which made him let go of the tail. And the next thing after that was that the mouse had picked itself up again, as if it were a ball bouncing off the deck, and there it was, facing him, and a horrid, long, bright, sharp thing, like a skewer, was waving to and fro within an inch of his stomach. This doesn't count as below the belt for mice in Narnia, because they can hardly be expected to reach higher.
Stop it, sputtered Eustace. Go away. Put that thing away. It's not safe. Stop it, I say. I'll tell Caspian. I'll have you muzzled and tied up. Why do you not draw your own sword? Poltroon, cheeped the mouse. Draw and fight, or I'll beat you black and blue with the flat. I haven't got one, said Eustace. I'm a pacifist. I don't believe in fighting. Do I understand, said Reepicheep, withdrawing his sword for a moment and speaking very sternly, that you do not intend to give me satisfaction? I don't know what you mean, said Eustace, nursing his hand. If you don't know how to take a joke, I shan't bother my head about you. Then take that, said Reepicheep, and that, to teach you manners, and the respect due to a knight, and a mouse, and a mouse's tail. And at each word, he gave Eustace a blow with the side of his rapier, which was a thin, fine, dwarf-tempered steel, and as supple and effective as a birch rod. Eustace, of course, was at a school where they didn't have corporal punishment, so the sensation was quite new to him. That was why, in spite of having no sea legs, it took him less than a minute to get off that forecastle and cover the whole length of the deck and burst in at the cabin door, still hotly pursued by Reepicheep. Indeed, it seemed to Eustace that the rapier as well as the pursuit was hot. It might have been red hot by the feel. There was not much difficulty in settling the matter once Eustace realized that everyone took the idea of a duel quite seriously, and heard Caspian offering to lend him a sword, and Trinian and Edmund discussing whether he ought to be handicapped in some way to make up for his being so much bigger than Reepicheep. He apologized sulkily and went off with Lucy to have his hand bathed and bandaged, and then went to his bunk. He was careful to lie on his side. Chapter 3. The Lone Islands. Land and
inside," shouted the man in the bows. Lucy, who had been talking to Rince on the poop, came pattering down the ladder and raced forward. As she went, she was joined by Edmund, and they found Caspian, Drinian, and Reepicheep already on the forecastle. It was a coldish morning, the sky very pale, and the sea a very dark blue, with little white caps of foam. And there, a little way off on the starboard bow, was the nearest of the Lone Islands, Felymouth, like a low green hill in the sea, and behind it, further off, the grey slopes of its sister, Doorn. "Same old Felymouth, same old Doorn," cried Lucy, clapping her hands. "Oh, Edmund, how long is it since you and I saw them last?" "I've never understood why they belong to Narnia," said Caspian. "Did Peter the High King conquer them?" "Oh no," said Edmund. "They were Narnian before our time, in the days of the White Witch. By the way, I have never yet heard how these remote islands became attached to the crown of Narnia. If I ever do, and if the story is at all interesting, I may put it in some other book."
"Are we to put in here, sire?"
asked Drinian. "I shouldn't think it would be much good landing on Felymouth," said Edmund. "It was almost uninhabited in our days, and it looks as if it was the same still. The people mostly lived on Doorn, and a little on Abra. That's the third one. You can't see it yet. They only kept sheep on Felymouth." "Then we'll have to double that cape, I suppose," said Drinian, "and land on Doorn. That will mean rowing."
"I'm sorry we're not landing on Felymouth," said Lucy. "I'd like to walk there again. It was so lonely. A nice kind of loneliness, and all grass and clover and soft sea air."
"I'd love to stretch my legs too," said Caspian. "I tell you what, why shouldn't we go ashore in the boat and send it back, and then we could walk across Felymouth and let the Dawn Treader pick us up on the other side?" If Caspian had been as experienced then as he became later on in this voyage, he would not have made this suggestion. But at that moment, it seemed an excellent one.
"Oh, do let's," said Lucy.
"You'll come, will you?" said Caspian to Eustace, who had come on deck with his hand bandaged.
"Anything to get off this blasted boat,"
said Eustace.
"Blasted,"
said Drinian.
"How do you mean?" "In a civilized country, like where I come from,"
said Eustace.
"the ships are so big that when you're inside, you wouldn't know you were at sea at all."
"In that case, you might just as well stay ashore," said Caspian. "Will you tell them to lower the boat, Drinian?" The king, the mouse, the two Pevensies, and Eustace all got into the boat and were pulled to the beach of Felymouth. When the boat had left them and was being rowed back, they all turned and looked round. They were surprised at how small the Dawn Treader looked. Lucy was, of course, barefoot, having kicked off her shoes while swimming. But that is no hardship if one is going to walk on downy turf. It was delightful to be ashore again and to smell the earth and grass, even if at first the ground seemed to be pitching up and down like a ship, as it usually does for a while if one has been at sea. It was much warmer here than it had been on board, and Lucy found the sand pleasant to her feet as they crossed it. There was a lark singing. They struck inland and up a fairly steep, though low, hill. At the top, of course, they looked back, and there was the Dawn Treader, shining like a great bright insect, and crawling slowly northwestward with her oars. Then they went over the ridge and could see her no longer. Tour now lay before them, divided from Vellemouth by a channel about a mile wide. Behind it, and to the left, lay Havre. The little right town of Narrowhaven on Tour was easily seen. "Hullo, what's this?" said Edmund suddenly. In the green valley to which they were descending, 6 or 7 rough-looking men, all armed, were sitting by a tree. "Don't tell them who we are," said Caspian.
And pray,
"Your Majesty."
why not?
said Reepicheep, who had consented to ride on Lucy's shoulder. "It just occurred to me," replied Caspian, "that no one here can have heard from Narnia for a long time. It's just possible they may not still acknowledge our overlordship, in which case it might be not quite safe to be known as the king."
We have our swords, sire.
said Reepicheep. "Yes, Reep, I know we have," said Caspian. "But if it is a question of reconquering the 3 islands, I'd prefer to come back with a rather larger army." By this time, they were quite close to the strangers, one of whom, a big black-haired fellow, shouted out, "A good morning to you." "And it is a good morning to you," said Caspian. "Is there still a governor of the Lone Islands?" "To be sure there is," said the man. "Governor Compass. His sufficiency is at Narrowhaven. But he'll stay and drink with us." Caspian thanked him, though neither he nor the others much liked the look of their new acquaintance, and all of them sat down. But hardly had they raised their cups to their lips when the black-haired man nodded to his companions, and, as quick as lightning, all the 5 visitors found themselves wrapped in strong arms. There was a moment's struggle, but all the advantages were on one side, and soon everyone was disarmed and had their hands tied behind their back, except Reepicheep, writhing in his captor's grip and biting furiously. "Careful with that beast, Dax," said the leader. "Don't damage him. He'll fetch the best price of the lot, I shouldn't wonder."
Coward, poltroon,
squeaked Reepicheep.
give me my sword and free my paws, if you dare.
"Whew," whistled the slave merchant, for that is what he was. "You can talk. Well, I never did. Blowed if I take less than 200 crescents for him. The Callerman crescent, which is the chief coin in those parts, is worth about 1/3 of a pound." "So that's what you are," said Caspian. "A kidnapper and a slaver. I hope you're proud of it." Now, said the slaver. "Don't you start any jaw. The easier you take it, the pleasanter all around, see? I don't do this for fun. I've got my living to make, same as anyone else."
Where will you take us?
said Lucy, getting the words out with some difficulty. "Over to Narrowhaven," said the slaver. "For market tomorrow."
Is there a British consul there?
asked Eustace. Is there a witch? Said the man. But long before Eustace was tired of trying to explain, the slaver simply said, "Well, I've had enough of this jabber. The mouse is a fair treat, but this one would jog the hind legs off a donkey. Off we go, mates." Then the 4 human prisoners were rowed together, not cruelly, but securely, and made to march down to the shore. Reepicheep was carried. He had stopped biting on a threat of having his mouth tied up, but he had a great deal to say, and Lucy really wondered how any man could bear to have the things said to him, which were sent to the slave dealer by the mouse. But the slave dealer, far from objecting, only said, "Go on," whenever Reepicheep paused for breath, occasionally adding, "It's as good as a play," or, "Blimey, you can't help almost thinking it knows what it's saying," or, "Was it one of you what trained it?" This so infuriated Reepicheep that in the end, the number of things he thought of saying all at once nearly suffocated him, and he became silent. When they got down to the shore that looked towards Dorne, they found a little village and a long boat on the beach, and lying a little further out, a dirty, bedraggled-looking ship. "Now, youngsters," said the slave dealer, "let's have no fuss, and then you'll have nothing to cry about. All aboard." At that moment, a fine-looking bearded man came out of one of the houses, an inn, I think, and said, "Well, Pug, more of your usual wares." The slaver, whose name seemed to be Pug, bowed very low and said in a wheedling kind of voice, "Yes, please, your lordship." "How much do you want for that boy?" asked the other, pointing to Caspian. "Ah," said Pug, "I knew your lordship would pick out the best. No deceiving your lordship with anything second-rate. That boy, now, I've taken a fancy to him myself. Got kind of fond of him, I have. I'm that tender-hearted, I didn't ever ought to have taken up this job. Still, to a customer like your lordship, tell me your price, carrion," said the lord sternly. "Do you think I want to listen to the rigmarole of your filthy trade?" 300 crescents, my lord, to your honorable lordship, but to anyone else. I'll give you 150.
"Oh, please, please," broke in Lucy. "Don't separate us. Whatever you do, you don't know."
But then she stopped, for she saw that Caspian didn't even now want to be known. 150 then, said the lord. As for you, little maiden, I'm sorry I cannot buy you all. Unrope my boy, Pug, and look, treat these others well while they are in your hands, or it'll be the worse for you. Well, said Pug, now who ever heard of a gentleman in my way of business who treated his stock better than I do? Well, why, I treat 'em like my own children. That's likely enough to be true, said the other grimly. The dreadful moment had now come. Caspian was untied, and his new master said, "This way, lad." And Lucy burst into tears, and Edmund looked very blank. But Caspian looked over his shoulder and said, "Cheer up. I'm sure it will come all right in the end. So long." "Now, missy," said Pug, "don't you start taking on and spoiling your looks for the market tomorrow. You be a good girl, and then you won't have nothing to cry about, see?" Then they were rowed out to the slave ship. among the islands and capturing what he could. The children didn't meet anyone whom they knew. The prisoners were mostly Galmians and Terabithians. And there they sat in the straw and wondered what was happening to Caspian, and tried to stop Eustace talking as if everyone except himself was to blame. Meanwhile, Caspian was having a much more interesting time. The man who bought him met him down a little lane between two of the village houses, and so out to an open place behind the village. Then he turned and faced him. "You needn't be afraid of me, boy," he said. "I'll treat you well. I bought you for your face. You reminded me of someone." "May I ask of whom, my lord?" said Caspian. "You remind me of my master, King Caspian of Narnia." Then Caspian decided to risk everything on one stroke. "My lord," he said, "I am your master. I am Caspian, King of Narnia." "You make very free," said the other. "How shall I know this is true?" "Firstly, by my face," said Caspian. "Secondly, because I know within 6 guesses who you are. You are one of those 7 lords of Narnia, whom my uncle Miraz sent out to sea, and who I have come out to look for. Argus, Bern, Octesian, Restamar, Marfamora, or I have forgotten the other. And finally, if your lordship will give me a sword, I shall prove on any man's body in clean battle that I am Caspian, the son of Caspian, lawful king of Narnia, lord of Cair Paravel, and emperor of the Lone Islands." "By heaven!" exclaimed the man. "It is his father's very voice and trick of speech. My liege, your majesty." And there in the field he knelt and kissed the king's hands. "The money your lordship disbursed for our person will be made good from our very own treasury," said Caspian. "They're not in Peg's purse yet, sire," said the Lord Byrne, for he it was. "And never will be, I trust. I have moved his sufficiency, the governor, 100 times to crush this vile traffic in man's flesh." "My Lord Byrne," said Caspian, "we must talk of the state of these islands. But first, what is your lordship's own story?" "Short enough, sire," said Byrne. "I came thus far with my 6 fellows, loved a girl of these islands, and felt I had had enough of the sea, and there was no purpose in returning to Narnia while your majesty's uncle held the reins. So I married, and have lived here ever since." "And what is this governor, this Compass, like? Does he still acknowledge the King of Narnia for his lord?" "In words, yes. All is done in the king's name. But he would not be best pleased to find a real, live King of Narnia coming in upon him. And if your majesty came before him, alone and unarmed, well, he would not deny his allegiance, but he would pretend to disbelieve you. Your grace's life would be in danger. What following as your majesty in these waters?" "There is my ship just rounding the point," said Caspian. "We are about 30 swords if it came to fighting. Shall we not have my ship in and fall upon Pug and free my friends whom he holds captive?" "Not by my counsel," said Byrne. "As soon as there was a fight, 2 or 3 ships would put out from Narrowhaven to rescue Puck. Your Majesty must work by a show of more power than you really have, and by the terror of the King's name. It must not come to plain battle. Gumpus is a chicken-hearted man and can be overawed. After a little more conversation, Caspian and Byrne walked down to the coast a little west of the village, and there Caspian winded his horn. This was not the great magic horn of Narnia, Queen Susan's horn. He had left that at home for his regent Trumpkin to use if any great need fell upon the land in the king's absence. Trinian, who was on the lookout for a signal, recognized the royal horn at once, and the Dawn Treader began standing into shore. Then the boat put off again, and in a few moments, Caspian and the Lord Byrne were on deck, explaining the situation to Trinian. He, just like Caspian, wanted to lay the Dawn Treader alongside the slave ship at once and board her, but Byrne made the same objection. Steer straight down this channel, Captain, said Byrne, and then round to Avra, where my own estates are. But first, run up the King's banner, hang out all the shields, and send as many men to the fighting top as you can. And about 5 bow shots ends, when you get open sea on your port bow, run up a few signals. Signals, too, said Trinian. Why, to all the other ships we haven't got, but which it might be well that Gumpus thinks we have. Oh, I see, said Trinian, rubbing his hands. And they'll read our signals. What shall I say? Whole fleet found at south of Avra and assemble at Burnstead, said the Lord Byrne. That'll do excellently. Their whole journey, if there were any ships, would be out of sight from the Narrowhaven. Caspian was sorry for the others, languishing in the hold of Puck's slave ship, but he could not help finding the rest of that day enjoyable. Late in the afternoon, for they had to do all by oar, having turned to starboard round the northeast end of Dorne, and poured again round the point of Avra, they entered into a good harbor on Avra's southern shore, where Byrne's pleasant lands sloped down to the water's edge. Byrne's people, many of whom they saw working in the fields, were all free men, and it was a happy and prosperous fief. Here they all went ashore, and were royally feasted in a low, pillared house overlooking the bay. Byrne and his gracious wife and merry daughters made them good cheer. But after dark, Byrne sent a messenger over by boat to Dorne to order some preparations. He did not say exactly what for the following day. Chapter 4. What Caspian did there. Next morning, the Lord Byrne called his guests early, and after breakfast, he asked Caspian to order every man he had into full armor. And above all, he added, let everything be as trim and scoured as if it were the morning of the first great battle and a great war between noble kings, with all the world looking on. This was done, and then in the 3 boatloads, Caspian and his people, and Byrne with a few of his, put out for Narrowhaven. The king's flag flew in the stern of his boat, and his trumpeter was with him. When they reached the jetty at Narrowhaven, Caspian found a considerable crowd assembled to meet them. This is what I sent word about last night, said Byrne. They are all friends of mine and honest people. And as soon as Caspian stepped ashore, the crowds broke out into hurrahs and shouts of Narnia, Narnia, At the same moment, and this was also due to Burn's messengers, bells began ringing from many parts of the town. Then Caspian caused his banner to be advanced, and his trumpet to blow, and every man drew his sword, and set his face into joyful sternness. And they marched up the street, so that the street shook, and their armor shone, for it was a sunny morning, so that one could hardly look at it steadily. At first, the only people who cheered were those who had been warned by Burn's messenger, and knew what was happening, and wanted it to happen. But then all the children joined in, because they liked a procession, and had seen very few. And then all the schoolboys joined in, because they also liked processions, and felt that the more noise and disturbance there was, the less likely they would be to have any school that morning. And then all of the old women put their heads out of the doors and windows, and began chattering and cheering, because it was a king. What is a governor compared with that? And all the young women joined in for the same reason, and also because Caspian and Drinian and the rest were so handsome. And then all the young men came to see what the young women were looking at, so that by the time Caspian reached the castle gates, nearly the whole town was shouting, and where Gumbus sat in the castle, muddling and messing about with the accounts and forms and rules and regulations, he heard the noise. At the castle gate, Caspian's trumpeter blew a blast and cried, "Open, for the king of Narnia, come to visit his trusty and well-beloved servant, the governor of the Lone Islands." In those days, everything in the islands was done in a slovenly, slouching manner. Only the little postern opened, and out came a tousled fellow with a dirty old hat on his head instead of a helmet, and a rusty old pike in his hand. He blinked at the flashing figures before him. Kim sees efficiency, he mumbled, which was his way of saying, "You can't see his sufficiency." No interviews without appointments, except between 9 and 10 p.m., second Saturday every month. "Uncover before Narnia, you dog!" thundered the Lord Burn, and dealt him a rap with his scrundled hand, which sent his hat flying from his head. "What's it all about?" began the doorkeeper, but no one took any notice of him. Two of Caspian's men stepped through the postern, and after some struggling with bars and bolts, for everything was rusty, flung both wings of the gate wide open. Then the king and his followers strode into the courtyard. Here a number of the governor's guards were lounging about, and several more, they were mostly wiping their mouths, came tumbling out of various doorways. Though their armor was in a disgraceful condition, these were fellows who might have fought if they had been led or had known what was happening. So this was the dangerous moment. Caspian gave them no time to think. "Where's the captain?" he said. "I am, more or less, if you know what I mean," said a languid and rather dandified young person without any armor at all. "It is our wish," said Caspian, "that our royal visitation to our realm of the Lone Islands should, if possible, be an occasion of joy and not of terror to our loyal subjects. If it were not for that, I should have something to say about the state of your men's armor and weapons. As it is, you are pardoned. Command a cask of wine to be opened, that your men may drink to our health. But at noon tomorrow, I wish to see them here in this courtyard, looking like men-at-arms and not vagabonds. See to it on pain of our extreme displeasure." The captain gaped, but Byrne immediately cried, for the king. And the soldiers, who had understood about the cask of wine, even if they understood nothing else, joined in. Caspian then ordered most of his own men to remain in the courtyard. He, with Bern and Drinian and 4 others, went into the hall. Behind a table at the far end, with various secretaries about him, sat his sufficiency, the governor of the Lone Islands. Culpus was a bilious-looking man, with hair that had once been red and was now mostly gray. He glanced up as the strangers entered, and then looked down at his papers, saying automatically, "No interviews without appointments, except between 9 and 10 p.m. on second Saturdays." Caspian nodded to Bern and then stood aside. Bern and Drinian took a step forward, and each seized one end of the table. They lifted it and flung it on one side of the hall, where it rolled over, scattering a cascade of letters, dossiers, ink pods, pens, sealing wax, and documents. Then, not roughly, but as firmly as if their hands were pincers of steel, they plucked Culpus out of his chair and deposited him, facing it about 4 feet away. Caspian at once sat down in the chair and laid his naked sword across his knees. "My lord," said he, fixing his eyes on Culpus, "you have not given us quite the welcome we expected. We are the King of Narnia." "Nothing about it in the correspondence," said the governor. "Nothing in the minutes. We have not been notified of any such thing. All irregular. Happy to consider any applications. And we are come to inquire into your sufficiencies, conduct of your office," continued Caspian. "There are 2 points especially on which I require an explanation. Firstly, I find no record that the tribute due from these islands to the crown of Narnia has been received for about 150 years.
That would be a question to raise at the council next month," said Culpus. "If anyone moves that a commission of inquiry be set up to report on the financial history of the islands at the first meeting next year, why then,
I also find it very clearly written in our laws," Caspian went on, "that if the tribute is not delivered, the whole debt has to be paid by the governor of the Lone Islands out of his private purse." At this, Culpus began to pay real attention. "Oh, that's quite out of the question," he said. "It is an economic impossibility. Your Majesty must be joking." Inside, he was wondering if there were any way of getting rid of these unwelcome visitors. Had he known that Caspian had only 1 ship and 1 ship's company with him, he would have spoken soft words for the moment and hoped to have them all surrounded and killed during the night. But he had seen a ship of war sail down to the straits yesterday, and had seen it signaling, as he supposed, to its consorts. He had not then known it was the king's ship, for there was not wind enough to make the Golden Lion visible, so he had waited further developments. Now he imagined that Caspian had a whole fleet at Bernstead. It would never have occurred to Culpus that anyone would walk into Narrowhaven to take the islands with less than 50 men. It was certainly not at all the kind of thing he could imagine doing himself. "Secondly," said Caspian, "I want to know why you have permitted this abominable and unnatural traffic in slaves to grow up here, contrary to the ancient custom and usage of our dominions." "Necessary, unavoidable," said his sufficiency. "An essential part of the economic development of the islands, I assure you. Our present burst of prosperity depends on it." "What need have you of slaves?" "For export, your as they serve you, except to put money into the pockets of such as Pug. Your Majesty's tender years, said Goopus, with what was meant to be a fatherly smile, hardly make it possible that you should understand the economic problem involved. I have statistics, I have graphs, I have... Tender as my years may be, said Caspian, I believe I understand the slave trade from within quite as well as your sufficiency, and I do not see that it brings into the islands meat, or bread, or beer, or wine, or timber, or cabbages, or books, or instruments of music, or horses, or armor, or anything else worth having. But whether it does or not, it must be stopped. But that would be putting the clock back, gasped the governor. Have you no idea of progress, of development? I have seen them both in an egg, said Caspian. We call it going bad in Narnia. This train must stop. I can take no responsibility for any such measure, said Goopus. Very well then, answered Caspian. We relieve you of your office. My Lord Byrne, come here. And before Gompus quite realized what was happening, Byrne was kneeling with his hands between the king's hands and taking the oath to govern the Lord Islands in accordance with the old customs, rights, usages, and laws of Narnia. And Caspian said, I think we have had enough of governors, and made Byrne a duke, the Duke of the Lone Islands. As for you, my lord, he said to Goopus, I forgive you your debt for the tribute, but before noon tomorrow, you and yours must be out of the castle, which is now the Duke's residence. Look here, this is all very well, said one of Goopus's secretaries, but suppose all you gentlemen stop play acting, and we do a little business. The question before us really is... The question is, said the Duke, whether you and the rest of the rabble will leave without a flogging, or with one. You may choose which you prefer. When all this had been pleasantly settled, Caspian ordered horses, of which there were a few in the castle, though very ill-groomed, and he and Byrne and Jinian and a few others rode out into the town and made for the slave market. It was a long, low building near the harbor, and the scene which they found going on inside was much like any other auction. That is to say, there was a great crowd, and Pug, on a platform, was roaring out in a raucous voice. Now, gentlemen, lot 23, fine Terebinthian agricultural laborer, suitable for the mines or the galleys, under 25 years of age, not a bad tooth in his head, good brawny fellow, take off his shirt, tax, and let the gentleman see. There's muscle for you. Look at the chest of him. 10 crescents from the gentleman in the corner. You must be joking, sir. 15, 18. 18 has been for lot 23. Any advance on 18? 21. Thank you, sir. 21 has been... But Pug stopped and gaped when he saw the mail-clad figures who had clanked up to the platform. On your knees, every man of you, to the King of Narnia, said the Duke. Everyone heard the horses jingling and stamping outside, and many had heard some rumor of the landing and the events at the castle. Most obeyed. Those who did not were pulled down by their neighbors. Some cheered. Your life is forfeit, Pug, for laying hands on our royal person yesterday, said Caspian. But your ignorance is pardoned. The slave trade was forbidden in all our dominions quarter of an hour ago. I declare every shave. Your life is forfeit, Pug, for laying hands on our royal person yesterday, said Caspian. But your ignorance is pardoned. The slave trade was forbidden in all our dominions a quarter of an hour ago. I declare every slave in this market free. He held up his hand to check the cheering of the slaves and went on. Where are my friends? The dear little girl and the nice young gentleman, said Pug with an ingratiating smile. Why, they were snapped up at once. We're here, Caspian, cried Lucy and Edmund together. And,
At your service, sire,
piped Reepicheep from another corner. They had all been sold, but the men who bought them were staying to bid for other slaves, and so they had not been taken away yet. The crowd parted to let the three of them out, and there was great hand-clasping and greeting between them and Caspian. Two merchants of Calormen at once approaches. The Calormens have dark faces and long beards. They wear flowing robes and orange-colored turbans, and they are a wise, wealthy, courteous, cruel, and ancient people. They bowed most politely to Caspian and paid him long compliments, all about the fountains of prosperity and irrigating the gardens of prudence and virtue and things like that. But of course, what they wanted was the money they had paid. That is only fair, sirs, said Caspian. Every man who has bought a slave today must have his money back. Pug, bring out your takings to the last minim. A minim is the 40th part of a crescent. Does your good majesty mean to beggar me? Whined Pug. You have lived on broken hearts all your life, said Caspian. And if you are beggared, it is better to be a beggar than a slave. But where is my other friend? Oh, him, said Pug. Oh, take him and welcome. Glad to have him off my hands. I never see such a drug in the market in all my poor days. Priced him at 5 crescents in the end, and even so nobody'd have him. Threw him free with other lots, and still no one would have him. Wouldn't touch him, wouldn't look at him. Tracks bring out sulky. Thus Eustace was produced, and sulky he certainly looked. For though no one would want to be sold as a slave, it is perhaps even more galling to be a sort of utility slave whom no one will buy. He walked up to Caspian and said, I see, as usual, been enjoying yourself somewhere while the rest of us were prisoners.
I suppose you haven't even found out about the British Council.
Of course not. That night they had a great feast in the castle of Narrowhaven, and then, tomorrow for the beginning of our
Real adventures,
said Reepicheep, when he had made his bows to everyone and went to bed. But it could not really be tomorrow or anything like it, for now they were preparing to leave all known lands and seas behind them, and the fullest preparations had to be made. The Dawn Treader was emptied and drawn on land by 8 horses over rollers, and every bit of her was gone over by the most skilled shipwrights. Then she was launched again and victualled and watered as full as she could hold, that is to say, for 28 days. Even this, as Edmund noticed with disappointment, only gave them a fortnight's eastward sailing before they had to abandon their quest. While all this was being done, Caspian missed no chance of questioning all the oldest sea captains whom he could find in Narrowhaven, to learn if they had any knowledge or even any rumors of land further to the east. He poured out many a flagon of the castle ale to weather-beaten men with short green beards and clear blue eyes, and many a tall yarn he heard in return. But those who seemed the most truthful could tell no tale of lands beyond the Little Islands, and many thought that if you sailed too far east, you would come into the surges of sea without lands that swirled perpetually round the rim of the world. floating islands, water spouts, and a fire that burned along the water. Only one, to Reepicheet's delight, said, "And beyond that, Aslan's country. But that's beyond the end of the world, and you can't get there." But when they questioned him, he could only say that he'd heard it from his father. Bern could only tell them that he had seen his 6 companions sail away eastward, and that nothing had ever been heard of them again. He said this when he and Caspian were standing on the highest point of Avra, looking down on the Eastern Ocean. "I've often been up here of a morning," said the Duke, "and seen the sun come up out of the sea. And sometimes it looked as if it were only a couple of miles away. And I've wondered about my friends, and wondered what there really is behind that horizon. Nothing, most likely, yet I am always half ashamed that I stayed behind. But I wish your Majesty wouldn't go. We may need your help here. This closing the slave market might make a new world. War with Calorman is what I foresee. My liege, think again." "I have an oath, my Lord Duke," said Caspian. "And anyway, what could I say to Reepicheep?" Chapter 5. The Storm, and what came of it. It was nearly 3 weeks after their landing that the Dawn Treader was towed out of Narrowhaven Harbor. Very solemn farewells had been spoken, and a great crowd had assembled to see her departure. There had been cheers, and tears too, when Caspian made his last speech to the Lone Islanders and parted from the Duke and his family. But as the ship, her purple sails still flapping idly, drew farther from the shore, and the sound of Caspian's trumpet from the poop came fainter across the water, everyone became silent. Then she came into the wind. The sail swelled out. The tug cast off and began rowing back. The first real wave ran up under the Dawn Treader's prow, and she was a live ship again. The men off duty went below. Trinian took the first watch on the poop, and she turned her head eastward, round the south of Avra. The next few days were delightful. Lucy thought she was the most fortunate girl in the world, as she woke each morning to see the reflections of the sunlit water dancing on the ceiling of her cabin, and looked round on all the nice new things she had got in the Lone Islands. Sea boots and buskins and cloaks and jerkins and scarves. And then she would go on deck and take a look from the forecastle at a sea which was brighter blue each morning, and drink in an air that was a little warmer day by day. After that came breakfast, and such an appetite as one only has at sea. She spent a good deal of time sitting on the little bench in the stern, playing chess with Reepicheep. It was amusing to see him lifting the pieces, which were far too big for him, with both paws, and standing on tiptoes if he made a move near the center of the board. He was a good player, and when he remembered what he was doing, he usually won. But every now and then Lucy won, because the mouse did something quite ridiculous, like sending a knight into the danger of a queen and castle combined. This happened because he had momentarily forgotten it was a game of chess, and was thinking of a real battle, and making the knight do what he certainly would have done in its place. For his mind was full of forlorn hopes, death or glory charges, and last stands. But this pleasant time did not last. There came an evening when Lucy, gazing idly astern at the long furrow or wake they were leaving behind them, saw a great rack of clouds building itself up in the west with amazing speed. Then a gap was torn in it, and a yellow sunset poured seemed to take on unusual shapes, and the sea was a drab or yellowish color, like dirty canvas. The air grew cold. The ship seemed to move uneasily, as if she felt danger behind her. The sail would be flat and limp 1 minute, and wildly full the next. When she was noticing these things, wondering at a sinister change which had come over the very noise of the wind, Trinian cried, "All hands on deck!" In a moment, everyone became frantically busy. The hatches were battened down, the galley fire was put out, and went aloft to reef the sail. Before they had finished, the storm struck them. It seemed to Lucy that a great valley in the sea opened just before their bows, and they rushed down into it, deeper down than she would have believed possible. A great gray hill of water, far higher than the mast, rushed to meet them. It looked certain death, but they were tossed to the top of it. Then the ship seemed to spin round. A cataract of water poured over the deck. The poop and forecastle were like two islands, with a fierce sea between them. Up aloft, the sailors were lying out along the yard, desperately trying to get control of the sail. A broken rope stood out sideways in the wind, as straight and stiff as if it were a poker. "Get below, ma'am," bawled Trinian, and Lucy, knowing that landsmen and landswomen are a nuisance to the crew, began to obey. It was not easy. The Dawn Treader was listing terribly to the starboard, and the deck sloped like the roof of a house. She had to clamber round to the top of the ladder, holding on to the rail, and then stand by while two men climbed up it, and then get down it as best she could. It was well she was already holding on tight, for at the foot of the ladder, another wave roared up across the deck, up to her shoulders. She was already almost wet through with spray and rain, but this was colder. Then she made a dash for the cabin door, and got in, and shut out for a moment the appalling sight of the speed with which they were rushing into the dark, but not, of course, the horrible confusion of creakings, groanings, snappings, clatterings, roarings, and boomings, which only sounded more alarming below than they had done on the poop. And all next day and all the next, it went on. It went on till one could hardly even remember a time before it had begun. And there always had to be 3 men at the tiller, and it was as much as 3 could do to keep it any kind of a course. And there always had to be men at the pump, and there was hardly any rest for anyone, and nothing could be cooked, and nothing could be dried, and one man was lost overboard, and they never saw the sun. When it was over, Eustace made the following entry in his diary. September 3rd, the first day for ages when I have been able to write. We had been driven before a hurricane for 13 days and nights. I know that because I kept a careful count, though the others all say it was only 12. Pleasant to be embarked on a dangerous voyage with people who can't even count right. I have had a ghastly time, up and down enormous waves, hour after hour, usually wet to the skin, and not even an attempt at giving us proper meals. Needless to say, there's no wireless, or even a rocket, so no chance of signaling anyone for help. It all proves what I keep on telling them, the madness of setting out in a rotten little tub like this. It would be bad enough, even if it was one of with decent people instead of fiends in human form. Caspian and Edmund are simply brutal to me. The night we lost our mast, there's only a stump left now. Though I was not at all well, they forced me to come on deck and work like a slave. Lucy shoved her oar in by, saying the Reepichee was longing to go, only he was too small. I wonder she doesn't see that everything in the little beast does is all for the sake of showing off. Even at her age, she ought to have that amount of sense. Today, the beastly boat is level
16 days. The poultry were all washed overboard. Even if they hadn't been, the storm would have stopped them laying. The real trouble is water. 2 casks seem to have got a leak knocked in them and are empty. Gnarly inefficiency again. On short rations, have a pint a day each. We've got enough for 12 days. There's still lots of rum and wine, but even they realize that would only make them thirstier. If we could, of course, the sensible thing to do would be to turn west at once and make for the Lone Islands. But it took us 18 days to get where we are, running like mad with a gale behind us. Even if we got an east wind, it might take us far longer to get back. And at present there's no sign of an east wind. In fact, there's no wind at all. As for rowing back, it would take far too long, and Caspian says the men wouldn't row on half a pint of water a day. I'm pretty sure this is wrong. I tried to explain that perspiration really cools people down, so men would need less water if they were working. He didn't take any notice of this, which is always his way when he can't think of an answer. The others all voted for going on in the hope of finding land. I felt it my duty to point out that we didn't know there was any land ahead, and tried to get them to see the dangers of wishful thinking. Instead of producing a better plan, they had the cheek to ask me what I proposed. So I just explained coolly and quietly that I had been kidnapped and brought away on this idiotic voyage without my consent, and it was hardly my business to get them out of their scrape.
September 4th. Still becalmed. Very short rations for dinner, and I got less than anyone. Caspian is very clever at helping, and thinks I don't see. Lucy, for some reason, tried to make it up to me by offering me some of hers, but that interfering prick Edmund wouldn't let her. Pretty old son, terribly thirsty all evening.
September 5th. Still becalmed and very hot. Feeling rotten all day, and I'm sure I've got a temperature. Of course, they haven't the sense to keep a thermometer on board. September 6th. A horrible day. Woke up in the night knowing I was feverish and must have a drink of water. Any doctor would have said so. Heaven knows I'm the last person to try to get any unfair advantage, but I never dreamed that this water rationing was meant to be applied to a sick man. In fact, I would have woken the others up and asked for some, only I thought it would be selfish to wake them. So I just got up and took my cup and tiptoed out of the black hole we sleep in, taking great care not to disturb Caspian and Edmund, for they've been sleeping badly since the heat and the short water began. I always try to consider others whether they are nice to me or not. I got out all right into the big room, if you can call it a room, where the rowing benches and the luggage are. The thing of water is at this end. All was going beautifully, but before I'd drawn a cupful, who should catch me but that little spy, Reap? I tried to explain that I was going on deck for a breath of air. The business about the water had nothing to do with him, and he asked me why I had a cup. He made such a noise that the whole ship was roused. They treated me scandalously. I asked, as I think anyone would have, why Reepicheep was sneaking about the water cask in the middle of the night. He said that he was too small to be any use on deck. He did sentry over the water every night, so that one more man could go to sleep. Now comes their rotten unfairness. They all believed him. Can you beat it? I had to apologize, or the dangerous little brute would have been at me with his sword. And then Caspian showed up in his true colors as a brutal tyrant and said out loud for everyone to hear that anyone found stealing water in future would get 24. I didn't know what this meant till Edmund explained it to me. It comes from the sort of books these Pevensies kids read. After this cowardly threat, Caspian changed his tune and started being patronizing. Said he was sorry for me, and that everyone felt just as feverish as I did, and we must all make the best of it, etc., etc. Odious stuck-up prig. Stayed in bed all day today.
September 7th. A little wind today, but still from the west. Made a few miles eastward with part of the sail, set on what Jernine calls the jerry mast. That means the bowsprit upright and tied. They call it lashed to the stump of the real mast. Still terribly thirsty.
September 8th, still sailing east. I stay in my bunk all day now and see no one except Lucy till the two fiends come to bed. Lucy gives me a little of her water rations. She says girls don't get as thirsty as boys. I had often thought this, but it ought to be more generally known at sea. September 9th. Land in sight. A very high mountain a long way off to the southeast. September 10th. The mountain is bigger and clearer, but still a long way off. Gulls again today for the first time since I don't know how long. September 11th. Caught some fish and had them for dinner. Dropped anchor around 7 p.m. in 3 fathoms of water in a bay of this mountainous island. That idiot Caspian wouldn't let us go ashore because it was getting dark, and he was afraid of savages and wild beasts. Extra water ration tonight.
What awaited them on this island was going to concern Eustace more than anyone else. But it cannot be told in his words, because after September 11th, he forgot about keeping a diary for a long time. When morning came, with a low gray sky, but very hot, the adventurers found they were in a bay encircled by such cliffs and crags that it was like a Norwegian fjord. In front of them, at the head of the bay, there was some level land, heavily overgrown with trees that appeared to be cedars, through which a rapid stream came out. Beyond that was a steep ascent, ending in a jagged ridge, and behind that, a vague darkness of mountains, which ran up into dull-colored clouds so that you could not see their tops. The nearer cliffs at each side of the bay were streaked here and there with lines of white, which everyone knew to be waterfalls, though at that distance they did not show any movement or make any noise. Indeed, the whole place was very silent, and the water of the bay as smooth as glass. It reflected every detail of the cliffs. The scene would have been pretty in a picture, but was rather oppressive in real life. It was not a country that welcomed visitors. The whole ship's company went ashore in 2 boatloads, and everyone drank and washed deliciously in the river, and had a meal and a rest before Caspian sent 4 men back to keep the ship, and the day's work began. There was everything to be done. The casks must be brought ashore, and the faulty ones mended if possible, and all refilled. A tree, a pine if they could get it, must be felled and made into a new mast. The sails must be repaired, a hunting party organized to shoot any game the land might yield, clothes to be washed and mended, and countless small breakages on board to be set right. For the Dawn Treader herself, and this was more obvious now that they saw her at a distance, could hardly be recognized as the same gallant ship which had left Narrowhaven. She looked like a crippled, discolored hulk, which anyone might have taken for a wreck. And her officers and crew were no better. Lean, pale, red-eyed from lack of sleep, and dressed in rags. As Eustace lay under a tree and heard all these plans being discussed, his heart sank. Was there going to be no rest? It looked as if their first day on the longed-for land was going to be quite as hard work as a day at sea. Then a delightful idea occurred to him. Nobody was looking. They were all chattering about their ship, as if they actually liked the beastly thing. Why shouldn't he simply slip away? He would take a stroll inland, find a cool, airy place up in the mountains, have a good long sleep, and not rejoin the others till the day's work was over. He felt it would do him good. But he would take great care to keep the bay and the ship in sight, so as to be sure of his way back. He wouldn't like to be left behind in this country. He at once put his plan into action. He rose quietly from his place and walked away among the trees, taking care to go slowly and in an aimless manner, so that anyone who saw him would think he was merely stretching his legs. He was surprised to find how quickly the noise of conversation died away behind him, and how very silent and warm and dark and green the wood became. Soon he felt he could venture on a quicker and more determined stride. This soon brought him out of the wood. The ground began sloping steeply up in front of him. The grass was dry and slippery, but manageable if he used his hands as well as his feet. And though he panted and mopped his forehead a good deal, he plucked away steadily. This showed, by the way, that his new life, little as he suspected it, had already done him some good. The old Eustace, Harold's and Uberta's Eustace, would have given up the climb after about 10 minutes. Slowly, and with several rests, he reached the ridge. Here he had expected to have a view into the heart of the island, but the clouds had now come over, and nearer, and a sea of fog was rolling to meet him. He sat down and looked back. He was now so high, the bay looked small beneath him, and mountains closed in all round him, thick but not cold, and he lay down and turned this way and that to find the most comfortable position to enjoy himself. But he didn't enjoy himself, or not for very long. He began, almost for the first time in his life, to feel lonely. At first this feeling grew very gradually, and then he began to worry about the time. There was not the slightest sound. Suddenly it occurred to him that he might have been lying there for hours. Perhaps the others had gone. Perhaps they let him wander away on purpose, simply in order to leave him behind. He leaped up in a panic and began the descent. At first he tried to do it too quickly, slipped on the steep grass, and slid for several feet. Then he thought this had carried him too far to the left, and as he came up, he had seen precipices on that side. So he clambered up again, as near as he could guess to the place he had started from, and began the descent afresh, bearing to his right. After that, things seemed to be going better. He went very cautiously, for he could not see more than a yard ahead, and there was still perfect silence all around him. It is very unpleasant to have to go cautiously when there is a voice inside you saying all the time, "Hurry, hurry, hurry." For every moment, the terrible idea of being left behind grew stronger. If he had understood Caspian and the Piemontees at all, he would have known, of course, that there was not the least chance of their doing any such thing. But he had persuaded himself that they were all fiends in human form. "At last," said Eustace, as he came slithering down a slide of loose stones, scree they call it, and found himself on the level. "And now, where are those trees? There is something dark ahead. Why, I do believe the fog is clearing." It was. The light increased every moment and made him blink. The fog lifted. He was in an utterly unknown valley, and the sea was nowhere in sight. Chapter 6. The Adventures of Eustace. At that very moment, the others were washing hands and faces in the river, and generally getting ready for dinner and a rest. The three best archers had gone up into the hills north of the bay, and returned laden with a pair of wild goats, which were now roasting over a fire. Caspian had ordered a cask of wine ashore, strong wine of Argent land, which had to be mixed with water before you drank it, so there would be plenty for all. The work had gone well so far, and it was a merry meal. Only after the second helping of goat did Edmund say, "Where's that blighter Eustace?" Meanwhile, Eustace stared round the unknown valley. It was so narrow and deep, and the precipices which surrounded it so sheer, that it was like a huge pit or trench. The floor was grassy, though strewn with rocks, and here and there Eustace saw black burnt patches, like those you see on the sides of a railway embankment in a dry summer. About 15 yards away from him was a pool of clear, smooth water. There was, at first, nothing else at all in the valley. Not an animal, not a bird, not an insect. The sun beat down, and grim peaks and horns of mountains peered over the valley's edge. Eustace realized, of course, that in the fog he had come down on the wrong side of the ridge, so he turned at once to see about getting back. But as soon as he had looked, he shuddered. Apparently, he had by amazing luck found the only possible way down, a long green spit of land, horribly steep and narrow, with precipices on either side. There was no other possible way of getting back. But could he do it, now that he saw what it was really like? His head swam at the very thought of it. He turned round again, thinking that at any rate he'd better have a good drink from the pool first. But as soon as he had turned, and before he had taken a step forward into the valley, he heard a noise behind him. It was only a small noise, but it sounded loud in that immense silence. It froze him dead still where he stood for a second. Then he slowed his head round and looked. At the bottom of the cliff, on his left, was a low, dark hole. The entrance to a cave, perhaps. And out of this, 2 thin wisps of smoke were coming, and the loose stones just beneath the dark hollow were moving. That was the noise he had heard, just as if something were crawling in the dark behind him. Something was crawling. Worse still, something was coming out. Edmund or Lucy or you would have recognized it at once, but Eustace had read none of the right books. The thing that came out of the cave was something he had never even imagined. A long lead-colored snout, dull red eyes, no feathers or fur, a long lithe body that trailed on the ground, legs whose elbows went up higher than the back like a spider, cruel claws, bat's wings that made a rasping noise on the stones, yards of tail, and the 2 lines of smoke were coming from its 2 nostrils. He never said the word dragon to himself, nor would it have made things any better if he had. But perhaps if he had known something about dragons, he would have been a little surprised at this dragon's behavior. It did not sit up and clap its wings, nor did it shoot out a stream of flame from its mouth. The smoke from its nostrils was like the smoke of a fire that will not last much longer. Nor did it seem to have noticed Eustace. It moved very slowly towards the pool, slowly and with many pauses. Even in his fear, Eustace felt that it was an old, sad creature. He wondered if he dared make a dash for the ascent, but it might look round if he made any noise. It might come more to life. Perhaps it was only shamming. Anyway, what was the use of trying to escape by climbing from a creature that could fly? It reached the pool and slid its horrible scaly chin down over the gravel to drink, but before it had drunk, there came from it a great croaking or clanging cry, and after a few twitches and convulsions, it rolled down on its side and lay perfectly still, with one claw at the air. A little dark blood gushed from its wide-open mouth. The smoke from its nostrils turned black for a moment, and then floated away. No more came. For a long time, Eustace did not dare to move. Perhaps this was the brute's trick, the way it lured travelers to their doom. But one couldn't wait forever. took a step nearer, then 2 steps, and halted again. The dragon remained motionless. He noticed too that the red fire had gone out of its eye. At last he came up to it. He was quite sure now that it was dead. With a shudder he touched it. Nothing happened. The relief was so great that Eustace almost laughed out loud. He began to feel as if he had fought and killed the dragon, instead of merely seeing it die. He stepped over it and went to the pool for his drink, for the heat was getting unbearable. He was not surprised when he heard a peal of thunder. Almost immediately afterwards, the sun disappeared, and before he had finished his drink, big drops of rain were falling. The climate of this island was a very unpleasant one. In less than a minute, Eustace was wet to the skin, and half blinded with such rain as one never sees in Europe. There was no use trying to climb out of the valley, as long as this lasted. He bolted for the only shelter in sight, the dragon's cave. There he laid down and tried to get his breath. Most of us know what we should expect to find in a dragon's lair, but as I said before, Eustace had read all the wrong books. They had a lot to say about exports and imports and governments and drains, but they were weak on dragons. That is why he was so puzzled at the surface on which he was lying. Parts of it were too prickly to be stones and too hard to be thorns, and there seemed to be a great many round, flat things, and it all clinked when he moved. There was light enough at the cave's mouth to examine it by, and of course Eustace found it to be what many of us would have told him in advance. Treasure. There were crowns, those were the prickly things, coins, rings, bracelets, ingots, cups, plates, and gems. Eustace, unlike most boys, had never thought much of treasure, but he saw at once the use it would be in this new world which he so foolishly stumbled into through the picture in Lucy's bedroom at home. They don't have any tax here, he said, and you don't have to give treasure to the government. With some of this stuff, I could have quite a decent time in here. Perhaps in Calumet. It sounds the least phony of these countries. I wonder how much I can carry. That bracelet now, these things in it are probably diamonds. I'll slip that on my wrist. Too big, but not if I push it up right here above my elbow. Then fill my pockets with diamonds. That's easier than gold. I wonder when this infernal rain's going to let up. He got into a less uncomfortable part of the pile, where it was mostly coins, and settled down to wait. But a bad fright, once it is over, and especially a bad fright following a mountain walk, leaves you very tired. Eustace fell asleep. By the time he was sound asleep and snoring, the others had finished dinner and become seriously alarmed about him. They shouted, "Eustace, Eustace, Cooey," till they were hoarse and Caspian blew his horn. "He's nowhere near, or he'd have heard that," said Lucy, with a white face. "Confound the fellow," said Edmund. "What on earth did he want to slink away like this for?" "But we must do something," said Lucy. "He may have gotten lost, or fallen into a hole, or been captured by savages." "Or killed by wild beasts," said Trinian. "And good riddance if he has." "I say," muttered Rince. "Master Rince," said Reepicheep, "you never spoke a word that became you less. The creature is no friend of mine, but he is of the Queen's blood, and while he is one of our fellowship, it concerns our honor to find him and to avenge him if he is dead." "Of course we're going to find him, if we can," said Caspian wearily. "That's the nuisance of it. It means a search party and endless trouble. Bother Eustace." Meanwhile, Eustace slept and slept and slept. What woke him was a pain in his arm. The moon was shining in at the mouth of the cave, and the bed of treasures seemed to have grown much more comfortable. In fact, he could hardly feel it at all. He was puzzled by the pain in his arm at first, but presently it occurred to him that the bracelet which he had shoved up above his elbow had become strangely tight. His arm must have swollen while he was asleep. It was his left arm. He moved his right arm in order to feel his left, but stopped before he had moved it an inch and bit his lip in terror. For just in front of him, and a little on his right, where the moonlight fell clear on the floor of the cave, he saw a hideous shape moving. He knew that shape. It was a dragon's claw. It had moved as he moved his hand, and became still when he stopped moving his hand. "Oh, what a fool I've been," thought Eustace. "Of course this brute had a mate, and it's lying beside me." For several minutes, he did not dare to move a muscle. He saw two thin columns of smoke going up before his eyes, black against the moonlight, just as there had been smoke coming from the other dragon's nose before it died. This was so alarming that he held his breath. The two columns of smoke vanished. When he could hold his breath no longer, he let it out stealthily. Instantly, two jets of smoke appeared again, but even yet he had no idea of the truth. Presently, he decided that he would edge very cautiously to his left and try to creep out of the cave. Perhaps the creature was asleep, and anyway, it was his only chance. But of course, before he edged to the left, he looked to the left. Oh, horror! There was a dragon's claw on that side, too. No one will blame Eustace if at this moment he shed tears. He was surprised by the size of his own tears as he saw them splashing on the treasure in front of him. They also seemed strangely hot. Steam went up from them. But there was no good crying. He must try to crawl out from between the two dragons. He began extending his right arm. The dragon's foreleg and claw on his right went through exactly the same motion. Then he thought he would try his left. The dragon limb on that side moved too. Two dragons, one on each side, mimicking whatever he did. His nerve broke, and he simply made a bolt for it. There was such a clatter and rasping and clinking of gold and grinding of stones as he rushed out of the cave that he thought they were both following him. He didn't look back. He rushed to the pool. The twisted shape of the dead dragon lying in the moonlight would have been enough to frighten anyone, but now he hardly noticed it. His idea was to get into the water. But just as he reached the edge of the pool, two things happened. First of all, it came over him like a thunderclap that he had been running on all fours. And why on earth had he been doing that? And secondly, as he bent towards the water, he thought for a second that yet another dragon was staring up at him out of the pool. But in an instant he realized the truth. That dragon face in the pool was his own reflection. There was no doubt of it. It moved as he moved. It opened and shut its mouth as he opened and shut his. He had turned into a dragon while he was asleep. Sleeping on a dragon's hoard with greedy, dragonish thoughts in his heart, he had become a dragon himself. That explained everything. There had been no two dragons beside him in the cave. The claws to right and left had been his own right and left claws. The two columns of smoke had been coming from his own nostrils. As for the pain in his left arm, or what had been his left arm, he could now see what had happened by squinting with his left eye. The bracelet, which had fitted very nicely on the upper arm of a boy, was far too small for the thick, stumpy foreleg of a dragon. It had sunk deeply into his scaly flesh, and there was a throbbing bulge on each side of it. He tore at the place with his dragon's teeth, but could not get it off.
spite of the pain, his first feeling was one of relief. There was nothing to be afraid of anymore. He was a terror himself now, and nothing in the world but a knight, and not all of those, would dare to attack him. He could get even with Caspian and Edmund now. But the moment he thought this, he realized that he didn't want to. He wanted to be friends. He wanted to get back among humans and talk and laugh and share things. He realized that he was a monster, cut off from the whole human race. An appalling loneliness came over him. He began to see that the others had not really been fiends at all. He began to wonder if he himself had been such a nice person as he always had supposed. He longed for their voices. He would have been grateful for a kind word, even from Reepicheep. When he thought of this, the poor dragon that had been Eustace lifted up his voice and wept. A powerful dragon, crying its eyes out under the moon in a deserted valley, is a sight and sound hardly to be imagined. At last he decided he would try to find his way back to the shore. He realized now that Caspian would never have sailed away and left him, and he felt sure that somehow or other he would be able to make people understand who he was. He took a long drink then, and I know this sounds shocking, but it isn't if you think it over. He ate nearly all the dead dragon. He was halfway through it before he realized what he was doing. For you see, though his mind was the mind of Eustace, his tastes and his digestion were dragonish. And there is nothing a dragon likes so well as a fresh dragon. That is why you so seldom find more than one dragon in the same county. Then he turned to climb out of the valley. He began the climb with a jump, and as soon as he jumped, he found that he was flying. He had quite forgotten about his wings, and it was a great surprise to him. The first pleasant surprise he had had for a long time. He rose high into the air and saw innumerable mountain tops spread out beneath him in the moonlight. He could see the bay like a silver slab, and the Dawn Treader lying at anchor, and campfires twinkling in the woods behind the beach. From a great height, he launched himself down towards them in a single glide. Lucy was sleeping very sound, for she had sat up till the return of the search party in hope of good news about Eustace. It had been led by Caspian, and had come back quite late and weary. Their news was disquieting. They had found no trace of Eustace, but had seen a dead dragon in a valley. They tried to make the best of it, and everyone assured everyone else that there was not likely to be more dragons about, and that one which was dead at about 3 o'clock that afternoon, which was when they had seen it, would hardly have been killing people a very few hours before, unless it ate the little brat and died of him. He'd poison anything, said Rince, but he said this under his breath, and no one heard it. But later in the night, Lucy was waked very softly, and found the whole company gathered close together and talking in whispers. "What is it?" said Lucy. "We must all show a great constancy," Caspian was saying. "A dragon has just flown over the treetops and lighted on the beach. Yes, I am afraid it is between us and the ship. And arrows are no use against dragons, and they're not at all afraid of fire." "With your majesty's leave," began Reepicheep. "No, Reepicheep," said the king very firmly. "You are not going to attempt a single combat with it, and unless you promise to obey me in this matter, I'll have you tied up. We must just keep close watch, and as soon as it's light, go down to the beach and give it a battle. I will lead. King Edmund will be on my right, and the Lord Trinian on my left. There are no other arrangements to be made. It will be light in a couple of hours. In an hour's time, let a
meal be served out, and what is left of the wine, and let everything be done silently.
Perhaps it will go away, said Lucy.
It'll be worse if it does, said Edmund, because then we shan't know where it is. If there's a wasp in the room, I like to be able to see it. The rest of the night was dreadful, and when the meal came, though they knew they ought to eat, many found that they had very poor appetites, and endless hours seemed to pass before the darkness thinned, and birds began chirping here and there, and the world got colder and wetter than it had been all night, and Caspian said, "Now for it, friends." They got up, all with swords drawn, and formed themselves into a solid mass, with Lucy in the middle, and Reepicheep on her shoulder. It was nicer than the waiting about, and everyone felt fonder of everyone else than at ordinary times. A moment later they were marching. It grew lighter as they came to the edge of the wood, and there on the sand, like a giant lizard, or a flexible crocodile, or a serpent with legs, huge and horrible and humpy, lay the dragon. But when it saw them, instead of rising up and blowing fire and smoke, the dragon retreated. You could almost say it waddled back into the shallows of the bay. "What's it wagging its head like that for?" said Edmund. "And now it's nodding," said Caspian. "And there's something coming from its eyes," said Trinian.
Oh, can't you see? Said Lucy. It's crying. Those are tears.
"I shouldn't trust to that, ma'am," said Trinian. "That's what crocodiles do, to put you off your guard." "It wagged its head when you said that," remarked Edmund, "just as if it meant no. Look, there it goes again."
Do you think it understands what we're saying? Asked Lucy.
The dragon nodded its head violently. Reepicheep slipped off Lucy's shoulder and stepped to the front.
"Dragon,"
came his shrill voice.
"can you understand speech?
The dragon nodded.
Can you speak?"
It shook its head.
"Then," said Reepicheep, "it is idle to ask you your business, but if you will swear friendship with us, raise your left foreleg above your head."
It did so, but clumsily, because that leg was sore and swollen with the golden bracelet.
"Oh, look," said Lucy. "There's something wrong with its leg. The poor thing. That's probably what it was crying about.
Perhaps it came to us to be cured, like Androcles and the lion." "Be careful, Lucy," said Caspian. "It's a very clever dragon, but it may be a liar." Lucy had, however, already run forward, followed by Reepicheep, as fast as his short legs could carry him, and then of course the boys and Trinian came too.
"Show me your poor paw," said Lucy. "I might be able to cure it."
The dragon that had been Eustace held out its sore leg gladly enough, remembering how Lucy's cordial had cured him of seasickness before he became a dragon. But he was disappointed. The magic fluid reduced the swelling and eased the pain a little, but it could not dissolve the cold. Everyone had now crowded round to watch the treatment, and Caspian suddenly exclaimed, "Look!" He was staring at the bracelet. Chapter 7. How the adventure ended.
course you have. It is the sign of a great Narnian house. This is the Lord Octesian's arm ring.
Villain, said Reepicheep to the dragon, have you devoured a Narnian lord?
But the dragon shook his head violently. Or perhaps, said Lucy, this is the Lord Octesian turned into a dragon under an enchantment, you know.
It needn't be either, said Edmund. All dragons collect gold, but I think it's a safe guess that Octesian got no further than this island.
Are you the Lord Octesian?
Said Lucy to the dragon, and then, when it sadly shook its head,
are you someone enchanted? Someone human, I mean.
It nodded violently. And then someone said, people disputed afterwards whether it was Lucy or Edmund said it first, "You're not Eustace by any chance?" And Eustace nodded his terrible dragon head and thumped his tail in the sea, and everyone skipped back. Some of the sailors with ejaculations I will not put down in writing to avoid the enormous and boiling tears which flowed from his eyes. Lucy tried hard to console him, and even screwed up her courage to kiss the scaly face, and nearly everyone said, "Hard luck," and several assured Eustace that they would all stand by him, and many said that there were sure to be some way of disenchanting him, and they'd have him as right as rain in a day or two. And of course, they were all very anxious to hear his story, but he couldn't speak. More than once in the days that followed, he attempted to write it for them on the sand, but this never succeeded. In the first place, Eustace, having never read the right books, had no idea how to tell a story straight. And for another thing, the muscles and nerves of the dragon claws that he had to use had never learned to write, and were not built for writing anyway. As a result, he never got nearly to the end before the tide came in and washed away all the writing, except the bits he had already trodden on or accidentally swished out with his tail. And all that anyone had seen would be something like this. The dots are for the bit he had smudged out. I went to sleep, Argos, Agrons, Draengon's cave, 'cause it was dead and aining so hard, woke up and get off me arm, oh bother, It was, however, clear to everyone that Eustace's character had been rather improved by becoming a dragon. He was anxious to help. He flew over the whole island and found that it was all mountainous and inhabited only by wild goats and droves of wild swine. Of those, he brought back many carcasses as provisions for the ship. He was a very humane killer, too, for he could dispatch a beast with one blow of his tail, so that it didn't know, and presumably still doesn't know, it had been killed. He ate a few himself, of course, but always alone. For now that he was a dragon, he liked his food raw, but he could never bear to let the others see him at his messy meals. And one day, flying slowly and wearily, but in great triumph, he bore back to the camp a great tall pine tree, which he had torn up by the roots in a distant valley, and which could be made into a capital mast. And in the evening, if it turned chilly, as it sometimes did after the heavy rains, he was a comfort to everyone, for the whole party would come and sit with their backs against his hot sides, and get well warmed and dried, and one puff of his fiery breath would light the most obstinate fire. Sometimes he would take a select party for a fly on his back, so that they could see wheeling below them the green slopes, the rocky heights, the narrow pit-like valleys, and far out over the sea, to the eastward, a spot of darker blue on the horizon, which might be land. the pleasure, quite new to him, of being liked, and still more of liking other people, was what kept Eustace from despair. For it was very dreary being a dragon. He shuddered whenever he caught sight of his own reflection as he flew over a mountain lake. He hated the huge bat-like wings, the saw-edged ridge on his back, and the cruel, curved claws. He was almost afraid to be alone with himself, and yet he was ashamed to be with the others. On the evenings when he was not being used as a hot water bottle, he would slink away from the camp and lie curled up like a snake between the wood and the water. On such occasions, greatly to his surprise, Reepicheep was his most constant comforter. The noble mouse would creep away from the merry circle at the campfire and sit down by the dragon's head, well to the windward to be out of the way of his smoky breath. There he would explain that what had happened to Eustace was a striking illustration of the turn of fortune's wheel, and that if he had Eustace at his own house in Narnia, it was really a hole, not a house, and the dragon's head, let alone his body, would not have fitted in. He could show him more than 100 examples of emperors, kings, dukes, knights, poets, lovers, astronomers, philosophers, and magicians who had fallen from prosperity into the most distressing circumstances, and of whom many had recovered and lived happily ever afterwards. It did not, perhaps, seem so very comforting at the time, but it was kindly meant, and Eustace never forgot it. But of course, what hung over everyone like a cloud was the problem of what to do with their dragon when they were ready to sail. They tried not to talk of it when he was there, but he couldn't help overhearing things like, would he fit along one side of the deck, and we'd have to shift all the stores onto the other side down below so as to balance? Or would towing him be any good? Or would he be able to keep up by flying? And, most often of all, but how were we to feed him? And poor Eustace realized more and more that since the first day he came on board, he had been an unmitigated nuisance, and that he was now a greater nuisance still. And this ate into his mind, just as that bracelet ate into his foreleg. He knew that it only made it worse to tear at it with his great teeth, but he couldn't help tearing now and then, especially on hot nights. About 6 days after they had landed on Dragon Island, Edmund happened to wake up very early one morning. It was just getting gray so that you could see the tree trunks if they were between you and the bay, but not in the other direction. As he woke, he thought he heard something moving, so he raised himself on one elbow and looked about him. And presently, he thought he saw a dark figure moving on the seaward side of the wood. The idea that at once occurred to his mind was, are we so sure there are no natives on this island after all? Then he thought it was Caspian. It was about the right size, but he knew that Caspian had been sleeping next to him and could see that he hadn't moved. Edmund made sure that his sword was in its place and then rose to investigate. He came down softly to the edge of the wood, and the dark figure was still there. He saw now that it was too small for Caspian and too big for Lizzie. It did not run away. Edmund drew his sword and was about to challenge the stranger when the stranger said in a low voice, "Is that you, Edmund?" "Yes. Who are you?" said he. "Don't you know me?" said the other. "It's me, Eustace." "By Jove," said Edmund. "So it is, my dear chap." "Hush," said Eustace, and lurched as if he were going to fall. "Hello," said Edmund, steadying him. "What's up? Are you ill?" Eustace was silent for so long that Edmund thought he was fainting. beastly time. They went to the rocks and sat down looking across the bay while the sky got paler and paler, and the stars disappeared, except for one very bright one low down and near the horizon. I won't tell you how I became a dragon till I can tell the others and get it all over. By the way, I didn't even know it was a dragon till I heard the way you were all using the word when I turned up here the other morning. I want to tell you how I stopped to meet one. Fire ahead, said Edmund. Well, last night I was more miserable than ever, and that beastly arm ring was hurting like anything. Is that all right now? Eustace laughed, a different laugh from any Edmund had ever heard him give before, and slipped the bracelet easily off his arm. There it is, he said, and anyone who likes can have it as far as I'm concerned. Well, as I say, I was lying awake and wondering what on earth would become of me. But mind you, it may have all been a dream, I don't know. Go on, said Edmund with considerable patience. Well, anyway, I looked up and saw the very last thing I expected, a huge lion coming towards me. And one queer thing was that there was no moon last night, but there was moonlight where the lion was, so it came nearer and nearer. I was terribly afraid of it. You may think that, being a dragon, I could have knocked any lion out easily enough, but it wasn't that kind of fear. I wasn't afraid of it eating me, I was just afraid of it, if you can understand. Well, it came up to me and looked straight into my eyes, and I shut my eyes tight, but it wasn't any good because it told me to follow it. You mean it spoke? I don't know. Now that you mention it, I don't think it did, but it told me all the same. And I knew that I'd have to do what it told me, so I got up and followed it, and it led me a long way into the mountains, and there was always this moonlight over and around the lion whenever we went. So at last we came to the top of the mountain, and I'd never seen before. And on top of this mountain there was a garden, trees and fruit and everything. In the middle of it there was a well. I knew it was a well because you could see the water bubbling up from the bottom of it, but it was a lot bigger than most wells, like a very big round bath with marble steps going down into it. The water was as clear as anything, and I thought if I could get in there and bathe, it would ease the pain in my leg. But the lion told me I must undress first. Mind you, I don't know if he said any words out loud or not. I was just going to say that I couldn't undress because I hadn't any clothes on, when I suddenly thought that dragons are snaky sorts of things, and snakes can cast their skins. Oh, of course, thought I. That's what the lion means. So I started scratching myself, and my scales coming off all over the place. And then I scratched a little deeper, and instead of just the scales coming off here and there, my whole skin started peeling off beautifully, like it does after an illness, or as if I was a banana. In a minute or two, I just stepped out of it. I could see it there, lying beside me, looking rather nasty. It was the most lovely feeling. So I started to go down into the well for my bath. But just as I was going to put my feet in the water, I looked down and saw that they were hard and rough and wrinkled and scaly, just as they had been before. Oh, that's all right, said I. It only means I had another smaller suit on underneath the first one, and I'll have to get out of it too. So I scratched and tore again, and this underskin peeled off beautifully, and I stepped and left it lying beside the other one, and I went down to the well for my bath. Well, exactly the same thing happened again, and I thought to myself, oh dear, however many skins now, so I just lay flat down on my back and let him do it. The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of the feeling the stuff peel off. You know, if you've never picked the scab of a sore place, it hurts like billy-o, but it is such fun to see it coming away. I know exactly what you mean, said Edmund. Well, he peeled the beastly stuff right off, just as I thought I'd done it myself the other 3 times, only they hadn't hurt, and there 'twas lying on the grass, only ever so much thicker and darker and more knobbly looking than the others had been. And there was I, as smooth and soft as a peeled switch, and smaller than I had been. Then he caught hold of me. I didn't like that very much, for I was very tender underneath now that I'd no skin on, and threw me into the water. It smarted like anything, but only for a moment. After that it became perfectly delicious, and as soon as I started swimming and splashing, I found that all the pain had gone from my arm, and then I saw why. I turned into a boy again. You'd think me simply phony if I told you how I felt about my own arms. I know they've no muscle and are pretty moldy compared with Caspian's, but I was so glad to see them. After a bit, the lion took me out and dressed me. Dressed you? With his paws? Well, I don't exactly remember that bit, but he did somehow, in new clothes, the same I've got on now, as a matter of fact. And then suddenly I was back here, which is what makes me think it must have been a dream. No, it wasn't a dream, said Edmund. Why not? Well, there are the clothes, for one thing. And you have been, well, undragoned for another. What do you think it was, then? Said Eustace. I think you've seen Aslan, said Edmund. Aslan, said Eustace. I've heard that name mentioned several times since we joined the Dawn Trader, and I felt, I don't know what, I hated it. But I was hating everything then. And by the way, I'd like to apologize. I'm afraid I've been pretty beastly. That's all right, said Edmund. Between ourselves, you haven't been as bad as I was on my first trip to Narnia. You were only an ass, but I was a traitor. Well, don't tell me about it then, said Eustace. But who is Aslan? Do you know him? Well, he knows me, said Edmund. He is the great lion, the son of the Emperor over the sea, who saved me and saved Narnia. We've all seen him. Lucy sees him most often. And it may be Aslan's country we are sailing to. Neither said anything for a while. The last bright star had vanished, and though they could not see the sunrise because of the mountains on their right, they knew what was going on, because the sky above them and the bay before them turned the color of roses. Then some bird of the parrot kind screamed in the wood behind them, and they heard movements among the trees, and finally a blast on Caspian's horn. The camp was astir. Great was the rejoicing when Edmund and the restored Eustace walked into the breakfast circle round the campfire. And now, of course, everyone heard the earlier part of the story. People wondered whether the other dragon had killed Lord Octesian several years ago, or whether Octesian himself had been the old dragon. The jewels with which Eustace had crammed his pockets in the cave had disappeared, along with the clothes he had been wearing. But no one, least of all Eustace himself, felt any desire to go back to that valley for more treasure. In a few days now, the Dawn Treader, remasted, repainted, and well-stored, was ready to sail. Before they embarked, Caspian caused to be cut on the smooth cliff facing the bay the words, Dragon Island, discovered by Caspian X, King of Narnia, etc., in the 4th year of his reign. Here, as we suppose, the Lord Octesian had his death. nice and fairly true to say that from that time forth, Eustace was a different boy. To be strictly accurate, he began to be a different boy. He had relapses. There were still many days when he could be very tiresome, but most of those I shall not notice. The cure had begun. The Lord Octesian's arm ring had a curious fate. Eustace did not want it and offered it to Caspian, and Caspian offered it to Lucy. She did not care about having it. Very well, then, catch as catch can, said Caspian, and flung it up into the air. This was when they were all standing looking at the inscription. Up went the ring, flashing in the sunlight, and caught and hung as neatly as a well-flown quoit on a little projection in the rock. No one could climb up to get it from below, and no one could climb down to get it from above. And there, for all I know, it is hanging still, and may hang till that world